After covering a lot of theory, I wanted to showcase some real-time use cases using Flask APIs. So that's why I'm entering this section, Flask in Action. And this will be more than 90% hands-on because I'll be implementing multiple projects. As you can see, there would be 5 projects in total. I'll not implement all of them. Some would be for your exercise. The first project would be based on customer relationship management or CRM. And in this project, I will implement a basic functionality of CRM. In the second project, I will create APIs for a newsfeed application or an online news channel. And here I'll be using multiple different databases, NoSQL, in-memory, and relational, all the 3 databases. And project number 3 would be a little complicated, where I'll be implementing assembly line use case. And the use case can be considered of a manufacturing assembly line or an electronics assembly line, whatever you might want to think it is, that is fine. But essentially there would be multiple APIs which would create assembly line and then call multiple nested APIs to achieve that purpose. Then I will deploy one of these projects either on ECS, AWS ECS, or AWS EKS, or GCP Google Kubernetes Engine. So it can be either AWS's Elastic Container Service or Elastic Kubernetes Service or Google Cloud's Google Kubernetes Engine. For project 4 and project 5, I will give you the exercise. I'll give you the data and how to load that data, and then you'll have to implement these 2 use cases using APIs. So let's dive in. The first one would be CRM or Customer Relationship Management. We'll be implementing this using the same methodologies that we have been using so far. I'll be sending multiple requests from Postman. One API would be to get customer details, another API would be to get loan details, and the third API would be to get customer account details, the data of which would be stored in Aurora MySQL. And in the command sheet, you'll get the commands to create the tables and load the files in Aurora MySQL database. And here are the points how those APIs would be implemented and what would be the API endpoints or URL endpoints. To get customer details, what am I going to do is that I'm going to use cust/custid, and I'll use the get method to implement the same. Then the second one would be to find if the customer has taken loan or not. Again, I'll use HTTP get method. It would be like for a particular customer, I would see how many loans the customer has taken. And I will also try to find out information about individual loan. So for that, I'll have to pass customer followed by customer ID, then loan and followed by the loan ID. So these are the 2 URL endpoints. One to see or get information about all the loans that the customer has taken, and the other one would be to get information about a single loan that the customer has taken. Then the third would be to find the account information of the customer, and I'll be using HTTP patch method to get the account information. And these are the endpoints. The first one would be /cust followed by the customer ID followed by ACCS. And once we get the accounts, I'll also try to implement an API which would find information of a particular account ID. And then finally, I'll implement all the customers who do not have loans. And the URL endpoint would be /cust/no loans. It's not loans, it would be no loans, like this. So I want to find the customers who have not taken loan. Now, what is this use case and why this is for and why it is part of customer relationship management? If you hold an account in a particular bank, what happens is that the banks assign something called relationship managers for all the customers. A single relationship manager handles multiple customers, and the purpose of the relationship manager is to make the communication channel open between all the customers and the relationship managers. And why this facility is given? Because the banks want to better the customer experience, and they want the customers to know that they are well taken care of. Not only that, if the customers want some specific feature or functionality, then they can reach out to the customer relationship managers to let's say, get a loan directly without going through anything. As you can see that the customer relationship managers would need access to some of the customer data, if not all. Obviously, the PII data and the sensitive data or the sensitive information would not be given, but at least they can get the account balance, the loan information, the number of accounts, etc., based on which they can make calls to the customer. So this is the purpose of a customer relationship manager. I have given you example only using bank. It is true for any organization. It can be non-financial organization also. Now, one thing here is that you might see that the implementation is pretty straightforward. So what is different that we are doing here? We have been implementing these type of APIs throughout our course. How this is different? Obviously, there's a catch. And the catch is that you'll have to implement all these functionalities using only one Python function. And that is the catch. So all these APIs have to be served from a single Python function. So let's open PyCharm and implement this. First, let me show you the Aurora implementation, or the Aurora cluster rather. And this is the same Aurora cluster that I have been using, Python Flask, Aurora, MySQL. And these are the endpoints. I have created the tables and loaded the tables also. And you'll find the commands in the corresponding commands sheet of that project. So this is what we do. We export and then we connect to Aurora using MySQL SH. And these are the tables that I have created in the CRMDB. So I have created CRMDB, and inside of CRMDB, I have created these tables. I have also created some indexes. Just copy and paste these commands. You can use load commands also to load the records. Just change the name of the bucket, and the name of the table should be exactly same. So let me connect to Aurora, and I have created multiple databases. One of them is CRMDB, which we'll use for this particular project, which is the CRM project. And if you connect to CRMDB and type show tables, you'll be able to see three tables. One is accounts, the other one is customers, and the final one is loans. And if I describe these tables, let's say, here are the schema of those tables, right? And as I said, I have loaded records to these tables also. And there are some fair amount of records in all these tables. Now, what am I going to do? I'll be creating a Python project which will be used to implement the APIs that I have just described. Before I show you the code, I would recommend, rather request you that you try it on your own. And once you have implemented your version of the code, then you can come and see this video or the part of this particular video, because it will give you an idea to implement a real life use case using Flask API. All right, let's start. You'll find all the project resources inside of the project folder. So I have multiple project folders. The first one is project 1 CRM. The second one is project 2 newsfeed. The third one is project 3 assembly line, airline, flight, and OTT. So these are the folders that I have, and if you are downloading it from GitHub, then the folder structure would be like this. Now this is the first project. Click on first project and you will see that I have all the files, CRM account data, CRM customer data, and CRM loan data. These are all CSV files, and I have used these files to load the Aurora tables. You'll find the commands also in the project folder. For example, project 1 underscore commands. Herein I have put all the commands that are needed to load the records in Aurora, the DDL statements to create the tables, etc. And then finally the program, and the name of this particular program is crm.py. A few things before I go into the program. I am using this global connection variable, and as earlier I'm connecting to the database only once and getting the connection object from there. And then I'm running the Flask application, and this is the function which is used to connect to the database. As I mentioned, the name of the database is CRMDB. So these are the common codes that I have implemented. Now let's go to the details of the other specifics of this code. Now, as you already know how to implement multiple URL endpoints using a single function, what am I doing here is that I'm using this @app.route, and here I'm mentioning multiple URL endpoints, as you can see, /cust/cust ID, then cust ID loans, customer cust ID loan ID, etc. And I'm passing the methods as well, because I want to make sure that the first three URL endpoints only send get method, and the last two URL endpoints, or the last three URL endpoints rather, can only be used using the HTTP patch method. Okay, now the question is that the URLs are very complicated. How do you implement all these URLs using a single Python function? And the very first point of consideration is that we'll have to use Flask type endpoint to get the parameters rather than query strings. Because imagine I want to get the loans for a particular customer, and I want to pass the cust endpoint / the customer ID, or the specific customer ID, then loans. It is not possible using query string. So we'll have to use Flask's default parameter implementation, like / followed by angular brackets, and we mention the parameter or the variable name inside of these angular brackets. This is the first point of consideration. You might have imagined that each endpoint would have a different action. How do you implement that? And that's where we'll have to use the request class. And as you already know that the request class has multiple variables and methods, and we'll be using the multiple variables provided by request class. So we're using both request class and Flask's default way of implementation parameters. Okay, so now how do we handle the logic? We have multiple endpoints, and this is where we'll be using Python's logic rather than Flask. So it would be a Python heavy implementation rather than a Flask heavy implementation. So what am I doing here is that I'm getting the base URL, which you can get from the variable of the request class, request.url. Now in the base URL, we'll get the entire URL. When we use these URLs, we'll be passing variables also, and the base URL would contain the variable also. And along with it, it will contain / and other things. So what am I doing is that I'm using if conditions to check what is the URL, what URL has been passed. And based on that, we'll take actions. First, I'm splitting the base URL using the / character. And what would happen is that each of these parameters or each of these words between slashes would be an array element. So for example, if I pass this URL endpoint, the first element would be cust and the second element would be the actual customer ID, which was passed by Postman. For the second one, the first element would be cust, the second one would be the customer ID, and the third element would be loans. For the third one, it would contain 4 elements, first element being the cust letter itself, and the last element would be value, or the value of loan ID that has been passed in the URL endpoint. So once I get that, this base underscore URL would be an array, right? And now let us go ahead and implement the logic. So for this, we'll have to take a note of how the URLs are. So first thing you notice that all the URL endpoints start with cust. So customer is something that is there in all the URL endpoints. For the first one, we'll have customer ID. For the second one, we'll have customer ID loans. For the third one, we'll have customer ID loan and loan ID, and so on. What am I checking here is that if the second last element is customer and the last element is not no loans, then I'll get the customer detail. Why am I doing it? Because if you see here, I'm trying to implement this particular endpoint. I cannot use only this variable or only this check rather, because for this one also the second last element or the first element rather would be cust. Now if you see here we have cust / cust ID, and here we have customer / no loans. So these two are more or less similar. The only difference is that here we'll be passing the customer ID and here we'll be passing the hard-coded string, which is no loans. So if the second last value is customer, but the last element is not equal to no loans, we know that this URL has been passed. And based on that, we'll get the logic to get the customer details, which will be retrieved from CRM DB, and we are fetching the customer ID. Likewise, if the last one is loans, if the last element is loans, then I'm getting all the loan details for that particular customer. So why I have put loans here at the last element, because if you see the URL, only this URL endpoint has loans as the last word. For the third one, it has loan followed by loan ID. For the fourth one, it has ACCS or accounts. So only for the second URL, we have the last element to be loans. Now, if the last element is loans, then I know that this URL endpoint has been sent to this API, and I'll have to send all the informations or all the loan information for a particular customer, because I'm getting the customer ID also. So that's why I'm selecting the customer ID and its corresponding loan ID from loans table, where customer ID is the value that has been passed, which is cust underscore ID, and I'm getting this cust underscore ID here, right? I'll come back to this. Why have I put 000? Let's proceed. Okay, so now, okay, for the third one, I'm saying that if the second last element is loan, then implement this particular logic, which means I want to get this information. So I want to get the loan information for a particular loan ID or for a particular loan account. And that logic has been put in place just to make sure that this URL is processed. Because if you see, the second last element is actually the word loan. And if I don't find any loan, then I'll send a message saying that no loan information for this account. Again, if the last element is accounts, then show us all the accounts for this particular customer. And finally, if it is account, then show us the account information, the account detail. The second last element is ACC. Now let's go back to the URL. And as you can see, if the second last element is ACC, I know that this URL endpoint has been passed, and I'll have to show the account details, or I'll have to actually return the account details for the account ID that has been passed. Then I have no loans, wherein I'm trying to find all the customers who do not have loans. And this is the SQL statement, which is used to find which customers do not have any loans, and then eventually I'm returning data. Now note that in all the processing logic, what I'm doing is that I'm sending, or I'm putting value in the data variable, data dictionary variable only, so that I can return only data dictionary. So in all the processing, you'd see that I'm using this data dictionary variable. Now coming back to this cust ID equal to 0, loan ID equal to 0, and account ID equal to 0. So it might happen that for some reason I'm not passing any value for the variables like customer ID, loan ID, or account ID. So if no values are passed, then what I have to do is that I'll have to make sure that there is some value that these variables get, because the processing is dependent on the URL endpoint, or how the URL endpoint is. So that's why by default, the customer ID will get a value of 0. The loan ID or the loan account number would also get a value of 0, and so would the account ID. So these are the default variables. So what would happen is, now if I query this SQL statement, then customer ID equal to 0 would be passed. So in that case, there won't be any information, so a blank dictionary would be returned. All right, so this is how I have implemented. And as I said, that please go ahead and try it yourself, and your implementation logic can be completely different than mine. That is perfectly fine. The only thing is that make sure to load the Aurora database and the tables with the data that I have given, because the API or the application is getting data from the Aurora database. Let's go ahead and try all the APIs. I'll be running it in my local machine, but I would recommend you to run it on EC2 instance and connect to the Aurora database from the EC2 instance itself. And I'm running this API or this particular Flask program on port number 8000. So let's open Postman and send the API request. I'll send all the API requests that are there. Alright, this is the main URL, which is the IP address of the local machine, followed by the port where I'm running the application, or API rather. And let's look at the API endpoints one by one. First, let's find out details of a particular customer ID, which is /cust followed by the customer ID, and I'm passing 1, 2, 3, and I'm getting error. The reason is that I have not started the program. And there is no customer with the ID 123, so I should not get any output. And the reason I'm getting error because there is no output and the Flask program is giving the error. So what it is saying that when I'm trying to put the record in the customer ID, it is not finding anything because there are no record. And this is your exercise to fix this. And there you will get a lot of errors actually. And as part of the exercise, you should fix those errors. Now, if I send a customer which is actually existing, I should not get any error because the program would work. And as you can see, I'm getting the customer ID, the email, the first name and last name with the customer ID. And if I send a customer which is not there, I'm getting an error because or the record variable contains a row from the cursor, but actually the cursor does not have any value at all. So we'll have to figure out a way to handle this error. That is part of your exercise. Now let's take a look at the second one. In the second one, what will you do? We'll try to find out the loans that this customer has taken. And the API endpoint is just type loans at the end. And if I send, this is the customer ID and this is the loan. Seems like there's a customer ID in the loans file, but not there in the customer ID file. It is fine because the data load was random. Let's try for this one. So this customer does not have any loan and we can cross check this in the database also. So as you can see, it is returning an empty set because there are no loans by this customer. Let's try to find out a customer which has loan and the customer ID is 162695. I'm not sure whether this customer is there in the customer database or not. Seems like it is. So let's try to find out the loans that this customer has taken. So it seems like the customer has only one loan and this is the loan account number, which is 1 million. And that gives us an opportunity to use this next API wherein I'll pass the loan ID to get the loan information. It is not loans anymore, it would be a loan. And let's try to get this. And this is the loan information. It seems like the loan was an education loan. This was the principal amount. The term month is 61 months and the interest rate is 8.31 for approximately 5 years. And the loan was taken on 5th June 2021. It will end on 9th June 2026. So we are getting the loan information also. So the fourth API is also working. The next API is to find the account information for this particular customer. And for that, I'll have to have the customer ID and then type ACCS because this is the URL endpoint. But I'm getting error. It is saying that method is not allowed. So we are using get method. But in the code, we used patch method to implement the last three APIs. So let's change it to patch and then send. And as you can see, these are the account information of the customer. One more thing I want you to note is that I'm using patch method, which does not make sense because using patch method to get an information does not make any sense, right? So that's where again the point comes that this is at the discretion of the developer. It is up to the developer how the developer wants to implement the HTTP methods. I could have implemented it using delete also, get also, does not matter. But as a best practice, you should always use the methods for the purposes it is meant to be. Okay, so I'm getting this account information and this is the first account ID. And let's try the next API, which is ACC followed by the name of the account or the account ID rather. This is the account ID and this is the account balance, which is pretty high, and the currency code is dollar. I'm not sure why this customer even took a loan. Anyway, so these are all randomly generated data which I generated. So that's why don't go by the relevance of the value. Just see whether the APIs are working or not. And to work on the APIs, you definitely need some data. So the account ID API is also working, and the last one is no loans. Let's try to find out the customers which do not have any loans, and there are a lot of customers you see. Obviously the output is not comfortable to the eye. You can format it as per your own need. Please go ahead and do that. modify the code and implement it in such a way so that it is easily readable. And there are a lot of customers which do not have any loan as such, right? So anyway, all the APIs are working. So we have implemented our first project wherein we send 6 APIs using Postman to a Python Flask application which is reading data from Aurora MySQL. But the interesting part was that we implemented all the URL endpoints using a single Python function. We did not implement it using multiple Python functions. Of course, for this, we had to use some logic in the program. So we mainly use Python logic. And as requested earlier, please go ahead and implement it using your own logic also. If you see that there is a better way to implement these URL endpoints using a single function, please go ahead and try that out.